So I'll start adding fields, asset tag, serial number, equipment type, make, model, our current location, condition, notes, and our last audits. Actually, we may want to call this last activity. And we can remove any unused fields here. So here's our fields here. Now we can define them. So you'll see we have a variety of different field types here. We can have a drop-down, a checkbox, a variable, a signature. We can do calculations and image capture. Since this is mainly going to be used for lookup purposes, I'm not really going to define anything here. The only thing I'll do is jump over to the form designer. And we can actually create a default form of what this is going to look like on the device. So I'll just leave that as is, and we'll jump over to our asset scan session where we'll be doing more configuration. So we can call, or actually start naming our fields here. So the first thing we want to do is select our transaction type. We're going to want the date. And then we'll start entering our asset-related fields. Okay. So we'll also add our location, our condition. In the event that it's damaged, we'll have an image field here, or maybe we'll call it photo. And if we need more than 10 fields here, that's what we create by default. You can add up to 100 fields. So I'm just going to add a few more fields here. So we have our condition, our photo, any notes that we may want. And then I'm going to add some fields that are going to be used strictly to update that asset list session. So when we do this particular scanning transaction, not only do we want to record the history, but we want to update that master asset list with the current location, the current condition, and that last activity. Also, if we entered any notes, that can also update to that master. So I'm just going to name some update fields here. So we want to update location. We want to update our date. We want to update our condition. And we're going to update notes. These 4 fields will actually be hidden from view, so I'm going to mark those as not visible. So I just uncheck this visible box. Now we'll start defining more characteristics about each field. So our transaction type, we'd probably want to select this from a drop-down. So I'm going to select a field type of drop-down, and then I can actually enter some values here. So maybe we have an asset issue, asset audit, or asset move. Jump over to our date field. We'll set the data type to date time, and then we can actually choose a custom date and or time format. This is useful for different regions that actually display dates differently. So you can either pick from this list, or you can actually even type into this box up here to actually form a custom date format. So I'm just going to do the standard date here. We can also make this read-only so that no one can actually modify that field. So our asset tag, that's something we're going to be scanning. So now these next series of fields here about the asset, we're not going to want to look that information, or basically key in that information, because that would be time consuming. So what we want to do is look up that information from that asset list. So you'll notice a lookup options tab here, so we can actually set these fields to look up from our asset list. So I'm going to enable the lookups. Our source session that we want to grab that data from is going to be the asset list. Then we want to define a relationship. So that's going to be based on the asset tag in the local and remote sessions. And then the source field we want to pull back in is the serial number. So basically we're saying look into the asset list session based on the asset tag field to bring in the serial number. I'll do the same for the equipment type. So that should be equipment type. And then we'll do the same for make and model. And one more. Okay, you'll also notice a return value if not found. So if I jump back up to a serial number, if we scan an asset that's not found in the asset list, we can present some text data in that particular field stating that the asset wasn't found. So I'll do that now. So next we have our location. This is going to be probably something you want to choose from, either from a drop-down or maybe even be something you would scan. Picture if you had barcodes on door jambs of certain rooms, you could actually scan that for the location instead of selecting it from a drop-down. In this case, I'm going to choose drop-down, and we'll just enter a few locations here. So we'll say room 101, room 102, room 103, and room 104. Conditions would most likely be a drop-down. So we'll enter some values here. We'll say new, good, poor, maybe damaged. And for photo, we'll have a field type of image. This will allow us to take a photo if the device has a built-in camera. Notes will just be free-form text that you would enter, so I'll leave that as is. And these 4 update fields, these are also going to be lookup fields, but we're also going to set these to be calculations. So by setting this as a calculation, the first thing we're going to do is a lookup. So once again, we're going to look up into the asset list based on the asset tag. And the source we want to bring back, or actually look up, is the current location. So now where the lookup and calculation comes in handy is this update source option. So with that checked, when we submit this record to this local session here, it's going to also update the source session, being the asset list, with whatever data ends up in this field. So that's where this calculated option comes into play. So we're just going to grab the data from our location field, which is this field 8 here. We're going to grab that in our calculation, and we can actually do a string calc. When this data type is set to general, we can actually add strings together. So we're just going to grab that location data, add it to this field 12 here, which is going to be blank. So now that we have that same matching location, once we submit that record with that update source checked, that's how it's going to update our asset list with that current location. So we're going to do the same thing for the remaining 3 fields here. First, we got to set that to calculated, enable our lookups into our asset list based on asset tag, and we want to grab the last activity. Check off our update source. And then in the calculated, we're going to grab the value from that date field in field 2. I'll just make these both calculated right now. So for our condition, same thing. going to grab the condition and update that field. We're going to grab that from our field 9 condition field. And finally, the notes. Grab our notes, update source, and then our notes from field 11. So now we've defined all our fields. The next thing we want to set up is how this form should actually flow. So you'll notice some after scan settings here. So once we select a transaction type, we're going to want that to go to the asset tag field. So once we scan an asset tag, since all this, the serial number, equipment, make, and model will be looked up, we want to jump over those fields and maybe go straight to the location. And from location, we're going to go to condition, and then maybe condition to photo and photo to notes. All right, and notes can stay with notes because that's the last field. There's also another option here where we can choose to not clear data on submit. So if you happen to be issuing assets in a certain location, you could choose not to clear certain fields. So the transaction type, maybe we want to keep that. If we're doing a bunch of asset assigns, we can turn clear on submit off. So now when we submit the record, that data is going to retain, so you don't have to keep re-entering. You can also do the same for this location here. Okay, so now if we jump over to our form designer and we create our default. So here's our form. I'll just bring up my mobile device. So this is an actual mobile device that's connected to my PC that I'm remote controlling. If I were to deploy this project now, we'll see that it should match what it looks like here in desktop. So if we look at asset scan, we have some refresh buttons here. Those are used for lookup fields. I'll show you how we can actually hide those. So you'll see this form looks kind of ugly right now. So now what we want to do is pretty this up a little. I'm going to drag this tab out here. Our drop-downs I'm going to make a little bigger so that they show as the same size as our other fields. And we're going to hide some of these refresh buttons by selecting the control. And if you look over at our selected control properties, you'll see a variety of different settings you can set for each control. But you'll notice the hide refresh button, so I'm just going to set that to true. So I'll do that for those 4 fields. Okay, and then maybe we want to align some of these fields. So if I actually click a control, and then if I hold the Shift key and highlight other or click other controls, we can actually use these align tools here to line these fields up to make it look a little neater. I can also do that with this picture field here. And we'll just make our transaction type a little bigger. The date fields, I'm actually going to show you how we can use a data-driven label. So I'm actually going to slide this record count down to the bottom. And I'm going to cut and paste this date field up to the top here. And we'll make that a little bigger. And if we jump over to our selected control properties, you'll see a data-driven option of true. And then we can select the field that we want to display. So this is a way you can display a field without actually having a field control in the form. You can display it as a label. That's another way to stop users from changing that data. I can also justify it, so I'll align it to the right. Now maybe we'll change some of the colors here. Maybe we'll make this a dark blue. And we can change these controls to be a dark blue with a white text. And maybe we want to slide these fields up. And that'll allow us to get our notes fields on this first page here. So I'm going to cut and then paste them over here. And then we can also align this using our align controls. And also we'll just change our record count color down here. And I'm not really going to use this clear all button, so I'm going to remove that. And we'll slide this over. Okay, so now if I save this and I go ahead and deploy that, we should now have a form that looks like what we just designed. If I jump over to our asset scan, here's our newly designed form. So you'll notice our date field is bleeding a little bit into the tab control, so we can actually fix that by highlighting that control and just setting the height, set it to 15. But also, if we look at our drop-downs that we created in desktop, you'll see that those are present. So now the next step is actually to get this data from our Access database over to our device. So I'm going to open our TracerPlus Connect software here, and I'm going to create a new project. So the first thing we want to do is add a profile. So we have something called a sync profile and a live profile. A sync profile meaning the data will be batch synced, whether you're cradled over USB, or you could also do this type of sync over Wi-Fi or WAN. This would require the pressing of a sync button, or even you can set up time syncs that can run at certain intervals. So I'll leave it at sync profile. So the first thing we want to do is actually link our TracerPlus desktop project to it. This will make your lives a lot easier when mapping the TracerPlus side to the database side. So we'll go to projects. I believe I call that IT assets. And then we'll just select the TPP and then create profile. So you'll see we actually have a profile here. We can name it. So maybe this one I want to call sync to device. And then we can start adding sync processes to this profile. So process 1, this would probably be sync asset list to device. So our source is going to be Odbc. So now the next thing we'll need to do is you'll notice there's an Odbc data source. So we're actually going to have to create a data source in Windows that points to our Access database. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. For those of you that have a 32-bit version of Windows, this can be accessed via the admin tools data sources Odbc. If you're using a 64-bit version of Windows like myself, you would actually access this tool via the C drive, Windows. There's a syswow 64 folder, and then there's an Odbc AD32, which is basically the 32-bit Odbc administrator. So if I open that, go to our system DSN, we want to create a new one. So this is going to be for Access. We'll pick our Microsoft Access driver, which is the MDB and ACCDB. We'll name it. We can call it IT asset. And then we'll select our database. So that's actually on my O drive. So I'm just going to browse to that folder. And it should be in there. So there's our IT asset track database. So I'll double click that. So now we have a data source of IT asset that's associated to our Access database. So I'll just hit OK and then OK again. I'll close these windows. So now if I were to click this refresh button, it's going to refresh all my data sources. So now if I look in the list, we should have our IT asset. So we do. So once we select our data source, we're going to see our available tables, which in this case we only had 2, our asset history and our asset list. So we're syncing the asset list to the device. We want to select asset list. Our destination of where the data is going to be synced to is going to be TracerPlus. Our session that we want to sync this to is asset list. So this is where the tying of the desktop project comes in handy. You'll see that it only has the sessions that are in our project. If you didn't associate that project, you would have a list of generic sessions of session 1 through 32, and then you would have to guess down here below how to map those fields. So we have asset lists, and then you'll notice our field mappings below, so the only thing we need to do is marry these fields up. So we'll see it doesn't marry up. We have an ID field here. Since that's an auto number field, that's typically something we don't map, so I'm just going to delete that. And we'll just add our last activity fields, or last audit. So now all of our fields marry up. The next thing we can do is select how we want that data to post to the destination. So do we want it to append? That means with each sync, it would just keep adding the data. We can overwrite it with each sync, or we can also update the existing. So say you have an asset list on the device. If you happen to change something on the database side, if you were to set that to update existing, it can update that row on your device with that particular data. So we'll do an update existing append if not found. And once we do that, we just have to define an update or update fields. So we're going to update this based on the asset tag. So when we sync that, it's going to look at the asset tag. If it finds it, it's going to update the remaining fields with any new data. If it doesn't find it, it's going to add it as a new row. So in our case, we don't have any data on the device, so it should just add 4 new rows for us. We also have options on the source side. This is for source filtering. I'm not sure that would be really useful in this case, but picture doing some sort of delivery routes. You can actually filter certain routes out to certain drivers. That's how that source filtering can come in handy. And then you can also delete data after a successful transfer, which we'll see when we're syncing from the device. All right, so we've defined our first process here. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. We'll call it IT asset. And if I jump over to the data viewer, we should see the same data we have in our asset list table in Access here. So we do. We also have a synchronized tab. So syncs can be done a variety of ways. You can actually, those who are familiar with our older Odbc Link product, the only way to do the sync was from Odbc Link itself. So that functionality is still available where you can actually open Connect and press these sync buttons here. As long as that device is in the cradle, it will go ahead and sync. What I'm going to show you today is actually how you can initiate that sync from the device. So the first thing we want to do is go to our project settings and go to the Connect. So this is where we can define Connect-specific settings to be used with Connect. So the first thing we want to do is add a host. So this is going to be the host name or IP address of the PC or server that you have Connect running on and what you want to sync to. So that's going to be my PC, so I'm going to enter my address. And the default port is 4403. That'll sync with the Management Studio open. Keep in mind you can also run this sync as a service. If you use port 4404, you can actually close the Management Studio here and still perform syncs. This is useful if you need to keep it running all the time, and if the server had to reboot for some reason, it's going to be running in the background as a service, so you should still be able to sync to that. Some other settings we have here are live sessions, which I'll go into when we actually do the real-time part of it. We have sync timers. This is where you can actually set up an interval of when to do syncs. So maybe you want to run a sync every 30 minutes. You can do that here. And then conditions, you can actually further refine that sync timer. That you could actually set it to sync between 12 and 12:01 a.m. at night, maybe. Maybe a worker puts their device in the cradle when they're done, and you want the sync to happen at midnight, but not happen after 12:01. That's where you can use the conjunction of a sync condition and the sync timer. So I'll just jump back over to the host. We also have a sync feedback. This is just a dialog that's going to display on the device when a sync is in place, or in progress, I should say. So now I'm going to add a third session called sync. I'll remove all our remaining fields here. We do have to leave one field in here. I'm going to start with a blank canvas, and I'm just going to add a button by clicking this button over here and then clicking on the form. I'll resize that, and I'll call it Sync to Device. And maybe we'll want to make this a little bigger. So now we want to define its button action. You'll see we have a bunch of different button actions available. In this particular case, it's going to be the do sync. So this is going to initiate a sync. And then for the do sync button action, we have two properties that you have to set. You have the sync host ID and the sync profile ID. So the host ID is going to be that host that we just defined. You'll see that it has an ID of 1. You could actually add more than one host to allow devices to sync to more than one PC. That would give you IDs of 2, 3, and so on. So since it's 1, we're going to set our host of 1. And then our profile ID, our profile ID is what we just configured in Connect. So if we jump back over to Connect and the configure, you'll see that the profile has an ID. So we have an ID of 1. When I create another profile, you'll see that it'll have an ID of 2. So this is how you can use profiles to control what should sync when. So when we press this Sync to Device, the only profile we're going to run is profile ID 1. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that over here. And I'll go ahead and deploy this to my device. Okay, so if we just look at our asset list, you'll see that there's 0 records in here right now. So if we go to our sync session, there's our Sync to Device button. And if we jump over to the Synchronize tab, we'll start to see some activity take place once I hit this button. Oh, what did I do? So we also have logging here to kind of see what we've done here. Did I actually repeat something? Yep. So you'll see right off the bat that I made an error in my data entry. This should actually have been a different asset tag number. Let me just change that. We'll close that. Let's try this sync again. So there's our sync successful. Now if we jump over to our asset list, we now have our 4 assets on our device. So now we can start doing some audits or issues. So if we jump over to our asset scan, maybe we want to do an asset issue. We scan our first asset. It's going to look up that information based on those lookups we defined. We can set our location. We'll say it's in room 101, and its condition is new, and then we can submit. So you'll see, because of that clear on submit that we unchecked, our transaction type and location remains. We'll just scan another asset here. Here's our monitor, select our condition, and we'll select that to be new. Now if I jump back over to the asset list, and if I were to edit some of these records here, we should see that that information was updated. We now have a current location, we now have its condition, and we have a last activity. So now we would want to get this data from the device back to the database. So we want to set up another profile and connect. So if we go over here to configure, we go ahead and add another sync profile. Once again, we'll marry up that desktop project. And create profile. We'll call this one sync from device. So our first process is going to be sync asset scans. So this is going to take the data from our asset scan session and post it to our asset history table. So the source is going to be TracerPlus. Session will be asset scan. Destination of Odbc and our IT asset data source. And we do want it to go to the asset history. And we just remove that ID field, and those mappings should marry up. Yep. So we're all good there. In this case, we're going to want to append with each scan, because these are basically transactional records. So we're going to append, but this is where that delete comes into play. We're going to delete the data off of the device once that sync is successful, so we don't end up with duplicate scans. So that's our asset scans. The next thing we want to do is update our asset list. Call that update asset list. It's going to go from TracerPlus, our asset list, to our Odbc destination of IT asset, and we're going to go to the asset list table. We'll just marry up our fields here, get our last activity and last audit. In this case, we do want to update existing. We'll do that update existing append if not found again, just in case we were to add a new asset out in the field. So this is going to be based on the asset tag. So that should be all set up and saved. So now if we jump back over to our desktop project, now we want to add a button to sync from the device. So I'll just copy this one because it has the same characteristics. We'll just change it to sync from device. And then we'll just change that sync profile ID to sync profile ID 2. As you can see, if I jump over to configure, this is now profile ID 2. So when we press that button, it's only going to sync that profile and not our other profiles. So I'll just push that out to the device. So if we just look at our asset scan, we should have 2 transactions there. Now if I jump over to the sync, we do our sync from device. You'll see a progress over here, sync successful. So the first thing we should notice is that the asset scan session should have 0 data in it because we deleted the transactions. And if we jump over to our database, we'll do a refresh. Here's our asset history that was just added. And if we jump over to our asset list, here's our asset list that's now updated with those asset assigned transactions we just did. One other thing I wanted to show you on the sync part of it is being able to actually sync a drop-down over to the device. So you'll see our locations. We had room 1 through 104 in our drop-down here. So typically you're going to have a lot more than that, and you're not going to want to have to key in all these drop-downs. So you may actually already have this in the database. So in this instance, I'm just going to create a table for it. So we'll call it. Once again, we'll have our auto number, and then we'll just have a location field. Set this to be our key. And then we'll save this as location. So now maybe you have a table that has all these different locations in it. So I'll just go ahead and start entering some locations here. All right. So we'll just do those 9 for now. So now what we want to do is jump back over to our configure. And since this is something we want to sync to the device, we can actually just add another process in our sync to device profile. So I'll add a process. We'll call it sync location DD for dropdown, coming from our source of Odbc and our IT asset. So we should have our locations table in there now. Going to a destination of TracerPlus, our session asset scan. But now you'll also notice a table drop-down that I didn't talk about before. So this is your option to sync either session data, which means you'll sync it to the session, or you're going to sync it to the drop-down field. So we're going to sync this to our location drop-down. And I'm just going to delete the ID field. We want to sync location to the display value. We also do have drop-down filters. So I could actually filter a drop-down based on certain selections. So picture, if you select an equipment type of PC, maybe you would have a sub-equipment type that would be filtered to only show options such as workstation, server, laptop, something to that nature. And that's where this filter value could come into play if you were syncing it from Connect. But we're just syncing these display values. We're going to do an overwrite. We'll just save that. Jump over to our asset, or actually our sync. We'll run our sync to device profile. So you'll see the progress in the background. If I jump over to the asset scan and we look at our location field, we now have all those locations in our drop-down that was just in our database table. Okay, so the final thing I want to show you is how you can actually do this in real time in what we call live mode. So we want to create a live profile in Connect. So if we jump back over to Configure, we go to Add a Profile. This time it'll be a live profile. Once again, we select our project. And then we can actually define where each of these sessions should point up to. So asset scan, that's going to be Odbc. That's our IT asset. And that'll update that table list. So that'll go to asset history. Our key field is ID. And we'll just map our fields correctly in here. Just swap our fields. Jump over to asset list. So this will be our asset list. Once again, key field ID. Actually, even in this case, we could use asset tag since it is unique. And then we'll just map up our fields here. Go ahead and save that. Okay, so now that we created the live profile, the next thing we need to do is define our live sessions. So that was this tab I was talking about before, this live sessions. So basically you're setting which session should be in live mode. So we want our asset scan and asset list to be in live mode. So we'll select our asset scan as a session, our host ID is 1, and our profile ID will be that ID for our profile. So in this case, it's 3. So we'll set that to 3. We'll do the same for asset list. You could actually use a combination of live and batch mode. So maybe you wanted the asset list to be accessible at all times via live mode, but the transactions that you collect, maybe you don't want to post those in real time, so you could actually store those locally and still do the sync while doing that lookup in a live type environment. I'm going to do both in this case, so I'm just going to deploy this over. Okay, so if we just go to the synchronized page and I go to open the asset scan session, we should see some activity happening here behind it connect. You'll see that this icon is now changed. This means you have a live connection to the database right now. So now if I were to select a transaction type, maybe we'll do an asset audit. And we'll scan an asset here. So that's going to do that live lookup into that asset list table. Select our room, select our condition, we'll say good. Enter any notes if we wanted to, all good. Now when I hit submit, this is going to post a transaction to the asset history table, as well as it should update the asset list. So you'll see I just refreshed that, so that was a post in real time right away to the database. And if we look at our asset history, we'll have a third row there. So those are the differences between a sync profile and a live profile and how you can use the different aspects. I hope you got a lot out of this webinar today. Sorry, it did run a little late, but I wanted to jam as much information in there as possible. But I want to thank, once again, thank everyone for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.